Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you lovely, curious minds. Welcome back to another episode of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. This is Chris Noble, your content creator, one of my best friends as well. Chris, how are you doing today?
Thank you, Brandon. You're one of my best friends too, buddy. I'm doing great today, man. I'm excited to talk about elongated skulls. It's going to be a
Ooh,
really fun one.
wow, we got into giants last episode, and now we're getting into elongated skulls. That is incredible stuff. Very interesting stuff as well. So
Yeah.
for our viewers, if you don't know, there is this theme that echoes through the world of antiquity and even perhaps modern day, where we look at these elongated skull people. The skeptics, just so you know, would say that elongated skull is due to skull binding. That's where they put boards and ropes or some device to while you're still a baby to gently encourage that skull to not be a normal shape, but to be more elongated, more cone heady. Thank you, Dan Aykroyd. Obviously, that man was very into a lot of these topics that we're getting into now.
Yep.
And that is proven true. There are some instances where that is true. However, still we have these references and this evidence that suggests that there was an elongated skull people, humanoid at least, if not a type of other breed of human. And perhaps they were a ruling class. That seems to be another theme in that people were trying to emulate them. So although we do have the actual skeptical view of where these elongated skulls come from, there's in a way there's this mocking, this emulation that is from almost the real deal. So Chris, where would you like to start on this subject?
Yeah, there's lots of cool places to start. I think actually I want to start with Egypt because for myself personally, that's where I first witnessed the elongated skulls in a lot of different examples in the Cairo Museum, at different sites across Egypt, in depictions of hieroglyphs and just reliefs on the walls, and also statues themselves. And you start to see them everywhere, and you really start to ask those questions. Is this all just cranial deformation or head binding, as Brandon was saying, where, from birth, they're just elongating their skulls? And then you have to also go back to the question of, well, why were they doing that in the first place? And, that's a lot of work and a lot of actual pain and a big process to do that. There's got to be a very good reason for that. So I would love to start in Egypt, because there were some pretty interesting examples. Then we can hop over to Peru and to the Paracas skulls that are even more famous. And there's lots of really interesting information we'll go over. I have a video of Brien Forester explaining the difference between the cranial deformation, the manual way that humans would head bind, which absolutely happened, is totally true. It's not that it didn't happen. However, as well, there's also these elongated skulls that completely are absolutely mismatched with the human skulls for so many different reasons. And we can go directly into the science of the skulls themselves, the way they're put together, and how they're clearly not human skulls. So I can pull up some images here. So for those of you guys listening, I'll explain these images while we're looking at them on video. So if you're watching on YouTube, of course, you can see this. And if you're listening, we will describe what you're seeing. So I'm going to pull up an image of Egypt and of the skulls that I saw, not here, but here. Okay. And so all over Egypt, I was seeing a lot of these very almost, I wanted to say football shaped heads, but even more so, they're quite almost circular at the end, so they don't trail off like a football does. It gets narrower at the end. They stay quite circular and large towards the end of their skull, and they almost look like you're taking a watermelon but just flattened it even more. And that's what their heads look like. And you see this everywhere. Really interesting examples. The pharaoh Akhenaten, which I'll click on here. You can see a larger image. This guy I saw all over the place. And I mean, there's just no part of this guy's face and head that looked human to me. I mean, just the shape alone looks more animal-like with a mixture of human, and very, very elongated, very stretched features that, humans have different looking faces, but only to a certain extent of the structure of the skull. This is very, very different. This really starts to look like just a different breed of being, very human-like, but not human. There's just the way in which their skulls are shaped and their heads are shaped are very odd. And even looking at the eyes of some of these other ones, very almond-shaped eyes, much larger eyes than we have. So once again, what will the skeptics say? They'll say these are exaggerations, these are metaphors, these are artistic renditions. And although that could be true for some of these, I couldn't help but feel and see constantly new and different examples of these elongated skulls. Sometimes on a smaller person, I was like, maybe this could have been manually done. But on others, like the Pharaoh Akhenaten, you can't recreate skull mass, and some of these skulls are just so much larger. That's one thing to shape a skull with head binding. It's a completely other to have a much larger skull that just is bigger, longer, and just it has more mass, more area. You can't do that when you're shaping the skull. You're just shaping it, you're not enlarging it. So Egypt was a really interesting place for me to start to see these shaped heads popping up. And then, of course, that leads eventually to the work of Brien Forester and the Paracas skulls of Peru, because that's where we can really start to get, luckily, more analysis of these things. But the last thing I'll say about Egypt is also, when you look at a lot of the headdresses that these Egyptians wear, these headpieces, they're always very, elongated again. And I know that sometimes they're doing this because they are trying to depict a very important symbol, or actually sometimes they're depicting aspects that are inside of the human brain, or different glands inside the human body that are very sacred to them. And I understand that. I've heard that before, and I get that. But I'm not able to zoom into this, but as you can see here in this image of a pharaoh with this elongated hat. Now his skull's not that long, but it is interesting how they fit the shape of an elongated skull. Like their head pieces would fit the shape of an elongated skull more than they would fit a regular human skull. So it's just another curiosity that I can't help but ask. So I'll click this last image here where you can actually see these elongated skulls in South America, basically like Peru and Egypt, and look at them. They're really similar, quite long, much longer than the human skull. And once again, these eye sockets are also larger. We're going to go into more detail in a little bit about the specifics in the elongated skulls versus human skulls, and how there's just too many things that are absolutely different and fundamentally different between the two. And that's where we can use science again to start eliminating fact from fiction here. So Egypt was quite
Chris,
profound for me.
If I can, I just want to say about these headdresses while we're on the topic, it seems like a bit of a normalization, in a sense that there are these people with these long skulls, and obviously the vast majority of the citizens of these cultures would not have these elongated skulls. And then we see positions of power always having these headdresses. I also think of the Catholic Church.
That's right.
The headdresses of the Catholic Church, an ancient organization with roots going back, obviously massive amounts of power involved in it. And then we have these headdresses, which once again normalize an elongated skull, perhaps to cover it up. Maybe these pharaohs were trying to mask it, to normalize themselves. But once again, yes, we see that if you had an elongated skull, this hat would either be emulating it, or perhaps even there to accentuate it. Just very interesting to me about, and I'm sure there's lots of other references of elongated hats, headdresses to put on to, say, someone with a accentuated skull.
Yeah, and like you said, it really displays power more than anything. And this is the interesting thing, I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. This is the interesting thing, is why would they elongate? Why would there be, let's say, potentially there is a group of beings that are probably not human that have these naturally elongated skulls, and then there were many humans that would practice this head binding to emulate and to mimic these elongated skulls. Why would that be? Well, one of the main theories towards this, which the one that I seem to gravitate towards, is these elongated skull beings were of elite status. Why? Advanced intelligence, advanced technology, perhaps that they have. Perhaps they weren't from Earth. They arrived, and anyone that's going to experience other beings arriving from somewhere else is going to usually, especially if they are of a lesser development, they're going to depict them as gods, godlike beings. And this is, of course, going into a whole other category where we throughout every culture on the planet talks about different gods, right? And are these just advanced beings that they had interactions with? So these paracas, or these elongated skulls that we see all throughout the world, could very well have been an advanced, highly advanced elite race of beings that may have ruled over humans at that time. And so what would the humans of higher status would mimic these elongated skulls. So actually what would happen, and this happens to this day in certain cultures, tribes, and communities around the world, where they still practice head binding and elongating their skulls, unnaturally. And the reason they do this is because it's only royalty that can do that. Average people in these societies, they don't do the head binding. It's the elites, in the human elites in these cultures, that will practice the head binding, because it represents an elite status, because they are mimicking these elite beings that at one point ruled over them and maybe do not anymore, but are still in their memory and their history. So they've carried this tradition onwards until today. So I think the main reasoning behind that is to mimic an elite status, because these beings were viewed as godlike beings, I guess.
Well, we see that even in our society within our own people. I mean, you look at the Kardashians and the different surgeries they've had to accentuate certain body parts. And I mean, I see it echoing through much of society, people getting their lips done. And, that's just a small sample size of how we can see this pattern still existing today. I'm not saying the Kardashians are aliens, or am I? No, I'm not. I'm not. But we idolize those of a higher power, a higher status, right? And they're obviously a higher status in our society. So let's go to South America. Because this is Peru, for those of you guys who don't know, is fairly progressive with all this. And actually places like Mexico and south of it, it's very interesting, their idea of disclosure, their idea of the, I'm going to say, paranormal, especially when it comes to out of place artifacts and stuff. It's a lot more liberal than the West. Here in North America, it's, there's always an answer. There's always a skeptical view, the kind of attitude.
We know better.
Right. And even though I have a hypothesis that is very unfounded or has very little evidence to support it, that's what we're going to go with, because otherwise it's crazy. So down in Peru, you can go to museums and they have elongated skulls on display. Now, that would not be happening in North America. Just at least, I mean, prove me wrong. I would love to go to that museum if I can go see it. But if you're in Peru, do go to Peruvian museums, because there's so much ancient architecture, ancient anomalies, high technology, high society, and anomalies like elongated skulls. So Chris, take us through a little bit of what you can expect to see.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And Brandon's absolutely right. Even in Mexico, checking out the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, which I haven't had the chance yet to do, but I will be doing probably this year at some point. I have to go back because it was just, what they can put on display there, like you mentioned, is far more liberal than what they put on display in North America, and even in places like Egypt. I know Egypt, they hide a lot of stuff, although it's kind of hard to hide stuff in Egypt because it's everywhere. But anyway, in South America and in Peru, yeah, you're going to get a lot of really incredible artifacts in some of these museums. Some of these museums even have artifacts depicting quite obviously aliens. I really couldn't say it any other way. Like the most classic looking almond shaped gray alien type looking things, spaceships that are quite clearly flying saucer, spaceships, and other shapes as well. Some of these have been deemed to be hoaxes, but some of them have definitely been legitimized. And I have some friends of mine that have actually been in expeditions down there, finding these artifacts and carbon dating them and legitimizing that they are indeed, ancient artifacts that depict not humans. Let's put it that way. So it's a real treasure trove down there, and something that's really worth checking out. Now, the main researcher that is pretty famous and synonymous with this research is, of course, Brien Forester, a fellow Canadian researcher that basically went down to Peru and saw these elongated skulls. And I think he was a med student. I can't remember his background exactly, but his scientific brain just went on fire with questions as to, these don't look like head binding looks one way. These elongated skulls look different. What's going on? And that question has led him to basically move and live permanently now down in Peru or the surrounding area. I'm pretty sure he lives in Peru and does these tours and does all this research. He's dedicated his life to this. And so what I can do here is, first of all, start showing some photographs of what we're talking about. And once again, I'll describe it for those of you listening here on the podcast. What he's been able to do is he's looking at some really interesting parts of the brain first and foremost. So he's measuring, as you can see here, he's measuring the skulls of regular humans, head-binded humans, and then, of course, the elongated skulls. And we're going to show a video in a sec of him describing that. It's also audio, so once again, you can listen to this without having to watch it. But look at these skulls here. I mean, the one on the left it's massive. It's literally twice the size of our skulls when you really get down to it. The one on the right's a smaller elongated skull, but still, it's a shape that you couldn't really get with head binding. And the one on the left, to me, just blows it out of the water because it's absolutely massive. And once again, I have to look at the eye sockets. Like, I feel my own eye sockets on my skull. And then I look at these things and my God, they're at least twice the size.
Well, there's a biological perfection that I can see in this skull. Like it looks like the divine. When we have human intervention, it's not going to be divinity in the shape of it in such a way that it looks natural.
Exactly.
As good as we can be, that looks organically grown.
Exactly. And so that's just for us who are not scientists and not medical professionals, we can still look with our own two eyes and see this. Where to me, I just look at this and the truth smacks me in the face. I don't need scientists to tell me that this is not human. I can look at this and easily determine with my own two human eyes that it's not me. This is not my species. And I want to know more about this. So,
well, skull binding too. I mean, when you're a baby, you have the three sections of the skull and they haven't quite set. And that's why we have to be so gentle with a baby's head, not let them sleep in certain ways because it can actually make it displace. However, to get the length of that previous skull, I mean, how long until that skull starts to harden? How long until that skull starts to set in place? You cannot skull bind a fully grown adult or child. Like, it is a small window that you're working with. So
they have to be a child because of the elasticity and the malleability of the skull. They only have that time in childhood, but to do that, otherwise it gets fully formed, and you're essentially going to break the skull if you try to do that kind of stuff. And kill the person essentially. And so down here, this is an interesting example of what says a deformed skull, and as far as I can tell, that means this is not a naturally elongated skull. It's a deformed one that may have undergone the process of head binding. And you can see the cracks and the imperfections here of that process. Like you said, Brandon, it doesn't look as natural and organic. It looks like it's been tampered with here. And so I think we can go over to let's go over to this video that I've got here. It's about 5 minutes long, so that should work out just perfectly time-wise here, of Brien Forester explaining this. Now I got to make sure that I'm going to stop the screen share for 2 seconds, start it, and then share sound so we can hear this. Let me know, Brandon, if you can't hear it. What am I doing here? Can you see the video?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Maybe you need to have more elongated skull. You figure it out.
Probably.
Today, I'm going to show you the difference between the Paracas ancient people and other people who have lived in this area. Now this person is an example of Inca. Not Inca as in Royal Inca, but Inca as in the time period of the Inca. This is a normal shaped skull, and this person's cranial volume was 1,200 cubic centimeters, which is an average human. Now this is an example of cranial deformation. The volume of this skull is 1,100 cubic centimeters. So again, basically normal. And you can tell, obviously, the deformation by the way it was flattened this way. String was wrapped around this way, possibly a board or some kind of material this way when it was a child, and the flattening was done in order to create this shape, which was desirable by these people. Now, another clue here is you see 3 cranial plates, which is normal. Your skull has that. The frontal, and then the 2 parietal plates. Now, the Inca one has that as well. It's a normal feature in a human being. And then we come to the Paracas. And this skull is very different from the other 2 I've shown you in many different ways. One thing is, in terms of plates, there are only 2. There's 1 frontal and there's 1 parietal. There are not 2 parietals, only 1. The volume of this skull is 1,500 cubic centimeters, so 25% larger than the Inca skull, shown as the example of what normality is. Also, the eye sockets are much larger. The nose seems to be larger. It has these 2 holes in the back, which are indicative of where nerves would come out of the skull to feed this part of the head. That is not a normal feature in a human being, in a normal human being. Now, the shape clearly could have been achieved via deformation in order, because we can see this obvious transformation here. However, it's the volume and the fact that there are hundreds of examples of this. There are actually 5 different kinds, 5 different styles of elongated skulls here in the Paracas History Museum. That could represent 5 different social classes. We don't really know. No one studied this since 1928. But what I really want to do, because there are so many people interested in these skulls, is to slowly rotate it for you so that you can stop and freeze frame it if you want at any given time to have a look. The jaw is also much larger than a normal human being, and there seems to be a genetic tendency to have fewer teeth, especially molars. In some cases, there are at least 4 molars missing, other cases 8. And some people have said that that would be the result of a poor diet, which isn't true, because the Paracas area was incredibly productive in terms of producing food, both seafood and also land-based agricultural products. And then this, we see, is an example of where trepanation occurred, brain surgery. Again, something seemingly pioneered by the Paracas and later adopted by people such as the Inca and the Nazca. So this is just a brief introduction to what I wish to show you here at the Paracas History Museum, and feel free to come at any time and explore this phenomenon with us.
Wow.
All right.
Just wow.
Right. So, yeah. It's just, and the one thing he didn't talk about that I've heard Brien mention is also where the spine lines up with the skull is a very different placement on these Paracas skulls than on the human skulls. And that's quite, again, it's significantly different enough that it's not just, oh, this is just a weird human with some abnormalities. No. This is a very different type of being. And all of these things, of course, add up to, like, if it walks and talks and squawks like an extraterrestrial or not a human, then it might actually be not a human, you know?
So, like, Chris, what is with the collective mainstream that we have these anomalies that come through, and why? Why is there no question of why? There's always a question of it's just a hard no. It's a hard stop. But trust us, we know better. Even though I see these kind of anomalies piling up, and there's always, like you said, the spine is different. There's nerve endings coming out of the top. The eye sockets are bigger. They have different teeth structure. The nose structure is different. It seems natural. We're missing a plate. These are all suggestions as any scientist or archaeologist or anthropologist would say, hey, what is going on with that? Where's the wonder? Why do we not have that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why I had a hard time in school. I was asking all those questions, and there just seemed to be this deafening silence. And, I think part of it is a bit of conditioning. I know my time spent in the academic world, there was really an attitude of, don't be ridiculous. That's preposterous. These are absurd ideas. If they venture almost anywhere outside of the norm of what we perceive to be our normal, quote unquote, reality, then it just starts to immediately threaten some sort of existential crisis within these people, because it overturns what they assumed was the reality. And it's like a safety net goes out from underneath them all of a sudden. There's also a lot of ego. And with a lot of intellectuals, I find sometimes it's really hard for them to admit if they've been wrong about something and to retract their statements and be like, oh, you know what? I was wrong. Of course, I've met many unbelievably intelligent academics and scientists who are amazing at doing that and being like, well, that's called science. You always have to reevaluate, and it's always changing and it's always evolving. But a lot of people can't seem to get their ego into check to be able to handle that. So I think there's that. I think there's also the threat that, what does this imply with the Paracas skulls, for example? It implies that there were non-human beings interacting with humans at the same time, and actually, if anything, were ruling over these humans. So this completely rewrites history. It adds a completely new element to history, and it also, of course, goes into the extraterrestrial, existential issues of we are not alone in this universe. If anything, we are the kindergarten kids of this universe, and we are surrounded by superior beings in terms of consciousness and intellect. And we have to have a very humbling spiritual process to then go through after that acknowledgement, because you really start to understand the superiority complex we have as a species has to get thrown out the window, because we're simply not as advanced as we think we are. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with admitting that. But there's a lot of ideologies that get overturned when you start to accept these theories. So I understand. I had to go through my own awakening when I was younger, learning about this stuff that we're talking about today. And it really threw me for a loop. I even went into a little bit of a depression, being like, what is real? What is going on? I don't know. Nothing. Like my brain's going to explode, So I get that sometimes it's challenging to change your belief systems. And that's what this is doing, basically.
Well, it's interesting that there's not only the denial, but there's also the punishment. Right? There's also the punishment. It's like, if you believe in this, then you are blank and you are blank. And there's
pseudoscientist.
Why is there a list of names? It's like curiosity becomes you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're ludicrous. I watched Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse, and I was reading articles on it before I watched the show, and it got me excited about the show because it was saying how it was dangerous information. If people believe this, what else will they believe? And when I watched the show, I'm like, where was this dangerous information? Was it dangerous that he suggested that society was more advanced further back? Or, there was no mention of alien warfare or maybe he might have mentioned a giant once or twice, but
not even. He was saying it was metaphor. He didn't even go down that avenue. It was quite conservative, to be honest.
Right.
From our perspective.
You hear words like fragility thrown out, and they use that, the mainstream uses that to accentuate agendas and stuff. But I see a lot of fragility in academia.
Yes.
And I studied history in university, and I may have mentioned this before, but I got kicked out of a few classes just for asking questions. They would like derail it and attack me, and I'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Before you make statements, let's see the primary documents. Otherwise, present it as it is a theory. So,
right.
Very interesting.
It's pretty nuts. Go ahead. What are you gonna say?
The elongated skulls. Just in closing, I keep hearing about the crystal skulls. Is there any? I think I remember seeing them even portraying it in their art, like you said. And I don't know if the crystal skulls have more of a a technological use, but seeing these amazing skulls, it just is echoed, and it just echoes around the world. And there's so many references. I'm pretty sure that some of the crystal skulls were elongated as well. And you hear stories of, the pharaohs. You see the statues with those thin-waisted people, elongated skulls. Once again, you see, it echoes in art. We have the cone heads and all of this. You hear stories of Antarctica. They dug up beings that looked like the Colossi, and the Colossi has that headdress on again. It echoes. The ripples of this keep going, and I don't think it's going to go away. And if anything, This just inspires. And we should do another episode, because not only are there elongated skulls, but there are different shapes and sizes. We did one episode on giants, but there are small beings.
Yes.
Fairy-like even.
Dwarf-like. Yeah.
Right. So it's just interesting. And I just want to thank you for bringing me through this, because this kind of thing is so interesting. And the fact that you can go to a museum and see this for yourself, I think, is to not be understated, because so many times these anomalies get destroyed.
Yep. Yeah. And the thing is that there's just too much stuff out there. I think there's a lot of suppression. I think that the Smithsonian and other organizations are famous for that. There's the scene at the end of Indiana Jones, the first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark, I believe. And that famous scene of they have the Ark of the Covenant, and then it gets put into this Smithsonian's storage unit with all these other identical looking boxes. And it just gets put to the back, and you can tell it's like, this is going to be going into an abyss of secrecy. No one's going to know about this. And you got to wonder how often that has happened in reality. Yet at the same time, we have so much evidence still to support that this was a much more elaborate planet and civilization. And we've gone through so many cycles of civilization, very likely. And the mysteries and the absolute amazement of what our history truly is just keeps getting more magical, more incredible, better than any science fiction film or book you could ever read or watch. And to close off with the Paracas skulls, I just think that this is, once again, a very tangible bit of evidence to show that we were intermingling with so many other beings in our past and probably in our present that just isn't making the headlines. But it doesn't mean that these other beings are completely gone. Their population may have been very significantly reduced, but they could be a couple still lingering around. We don't know. And it just shows that so much of our knowledge to where we are today has likely come from sharing that knowledge with other beings from other places in this universe, or perhaps from within the earth or other places on the earth that we aren't aware of. The fact of the matter is that we have to keep our minds open to these possibilities, because as soon as we close them off, we're eliminating these possibilities. And that's where science and innovation stop, is when we close our minds to these possibilities. And, is everything we talked about today accurate 100%? Of course not, because we're still learning and we need to know more information. But, looking at these skulls and the way we've described them as just abnormally elongated to our listeners, you really have to start to scratch your head and wonder, what is our true history? Who were we interacting with? And where did we get all this knowledge from? Could this be a clue as to where we got some of our knowledge in the distant past?
Well, and coming at it once again from my angle as a screenwriter, actor, storyteller, these ideas that we see, they seem so far out there. However, the Spielbergs, there's so many storytellers who we worship, who we look up to, who we idolize. They obviously have these curiosities. Stranger Things was based off the Montauk Project, which we might do an episode on in the future.
Yeah, MK Ultra.
The idea of aliens and out of place artifacts and suppressed history and high technology, these are not foreign to us as a collective. They echo in our stories, and they make damn good stories too, because once again, no one's watching Indiana Jones where all he's doing is trying to find a couple clay pots.
No.
That's not that exciting. We want to see the mystery. We want to see the amazement. We want to see the magic of the world, and I do believe it exists. So,
and just to really quickly, the crystal skulls, I forgot to touch on that. The crystal skulls are something we should talk about in other episodes, because I think they're advanced tech. They've done experiments shining lasers through them, and all of a sudden they have sometimes like actual infographics projected through them where they're getting like geometry and other forms of information coming through these skulls. So I think we're talking about really advanced tech, which is another fantastic thing to discuss on another episode. So thanks for bringing that up.
I saw a quote one time referring to alchemy as, we don't believe it exists, but then our computers are actually made up of all these rare metals in such a way, and then they work in such a way. So alchemy could be real, and we could be seeing it unfolding before us. So we're going to run out of time here. So why don't we close this one off on Elongated Skulls? Thanks for listening, all you curious people. Don't forget, for only 33 cents a day, you can become a Ancient Mysteries Unearthed community member, supporting this content creator, getting him to keep making excellent work, in engaging in amazing conversations like we had today. So, Christopher, thank you so much. Anything you want to say to your viewers?
No, thanks so much for listening, everybody, and watching. And thank you, Brandon, for hosting as always, buddy. I really appreciate our conversations. This is always so much fun, and looking forward to the next episode.
Okay, everyone, stay curious, stay kind. We'll see you next time.
Take care.